Season 4 has arrived in MotorFest, and with it comes the Buick GNX. Now, the Buick GNX has 300 horsepower and a 0 to 60 in under 5 seconds. So why then is it classed with a Volkswagen Beetle? Well, that issue lies with a larger problem with MotorFest's street classes. MotorFest cars are divided into Street Tier 1 and Street Tier 2, and while this is supposed to organize them, it doesn't quite work, and instead turns into two classes where cars are just kind of dumped without any thought. This results in some really weird classifications, like the ND Miata being in Street Tier 2, but the Abarth 124, which is the same car on the same platform with the same performance, being in Street Tier 1. This in turn means that the ND Miata is classed with the Ford GT, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense. This issue affects both of these classes pretty badly, where there's a lot of cars that just don't belong anywhere, and it also creates an issue where every class develops a pretty serious meta, especially Street Tier 1. If you've seen the RS2 meta, you probably know what I'm talking about. On top of that, if you know anything about cars, the entire system for these street classes just comes off as kind of ridiculous. Obviously, this system needs a fix, and these cars need to be classed better, so here is how I would solve it. Our current class system is 2 tiers, 1 and 2, and contains everything from Volkswagen buses in Tier 1 to Lamborghini Huracans in Tier 2. Obviously, that's not a lot of room to divide these, so the first thing I would do is break this down into 5 street classes with an additional supercar class. Street classes would be labeled E through A, with E being the slowest and A being the fastest, and the fastest of these cars, such as the Huracan or some of the really high-end cars, would be labeled into supercar class. Now, when I say fastest, I'm talking about capability overall. Obviously, every vehicle has its strengths and its weaknesses: speed, acceleration, handling. I'm going off a general idea of performance. With that said, we are going to start with Street Tier E. Street Tier E is our slowest class. It's the bottom of the list here, and it would have a performance level of 550. This would be the class for things like the VW Bus, the VW Beetle, the classic Chevy pickup truck, the 3100 that's in the game. Other vehicles like that are interesting, they're cool to drive, but they're so slow and they just really can't get out of their own way. They don't really have any particular handling traits. They're just kind of there to be interesting, and they're not very fast or really sporty in the slightest. That's not to say these vehicles are bad in any way. It's just not fair to pit them up against anything that's even slightly fast or sporty or has any power. Street Tier D is next. These cars come in at performance level 600 max. These would be things like the entire Crown Vic lineup, most of what's in Cadillac's lineup, vehicles like the Silverado, the Escalade that are utilitarian but not super slow like the Wrangler or Hummer, but still relatively slow. Also things like the classic Mini Cooper, the Mazda Cosmos, the RX-3, as well as things like the Mitsubishi FTO or the NA Miata. This is really for either very, very slow sporty cars, Miata-esque cars, or just kind of cruisers. Cars that they're not super slow. Can't get out of their own way slow, but they're not really fast. The Crown Vic is a great example of what would go into this class. It really embodies all of it. It's fun to drive, not a ton of power, but it has no problem getting up and going either. Street Tier C would max out at performance level 650. This is things like hot hatches, slower tuners like the Integra and S-Chassis, slower muscle cars like the Firebird, things like the newer Mini Coopers, things of that nature. Cars like the FCRX7 and the newer Miata and the Abarth 124 are good examples of what would be in this class. There's a lot of things in MotorFest that would fall into this category. I could sit here all day and list them. The general idea is that these are sporty vehicles. They aren't super fast yet, but they're sporty, they're older, some of them are newer. This is also where we'd see a lot of the older sports cars like the E-Type, the 240Z, things like that, being mixed in with some newer vehicles. Street Tier B is where things really start to get fast. This class would max out at performance level 700, and this would really be the Halo import tuners of the 80s and 90s, the Halo muscle cars of the 60s, lots of more modern cars such as the 350Z and the RX-8. We'd start to get a lot of modern sports cars in this class. Basically the best of the best from several eras. You'd also see the highest end of the European classic sports cars, such as the Lancia Stratos, fall into this class. There's a lot that's in this class, and there's a lot of back and forth, I think, that could be had about how much of this that's in this class could go into Tier C and how much could stay in Tier B, and maybe some of these cars need to even go to Tier A. There's quite a bit of, just like Tier C, there's quite a bit that would fall into this in MotorFest. However, I think it would overall be mainly the bridge between the world of classic cars and the world of very modern sports cars. Once you exit Street Tier B, you'd be entering Tier A, which means you've pretty much left all of the classic cars behind. Street Tier A is the final street class and would have a performance level cap of 750, which would match the current Street Tier 2 cap of 750. This would be your modern sports cars, modern Grand Tourers, modern muscle cars, track toys, things of that nature. This is where you'd find things like the A90 Supra, the S550 Mustang GT, modern Mercedes sports cars, things like the new Z, the R35, any sort of modern sports car from the mid-end to the high-end that's been manufactured in the last 20 years or so and doesn't fall into B. There's quite a bit you could play around with in here and say, oh, this goes to B, or this could be a supercar, but this is, again, another class that would be massive in MotorFest because of the sheer amount of cars that would fall into it and the sheer amount of cars that end up in this class every update. The bulk of what has been added to both the Crew 2 or MotorFest over the years would fall in between Street Tier A and Street Tier C. That said, this would be the peak class for Street itself, and after this, you move into Supercar. Supercar, it would be the class that separates out the really high end from A, and there's a lot that you could take there and say, well, this might belong in A. Again, this is all subjective. Supercar is our final class, and this would have a max performance level of 800, which would put it between the highest street class and hypercar. Now, what in hypercar should be supercar and vice versa is an entire other debate. However, supercar would be the fastest of the fastest and the best of the best out of the street classes. Now, some of this is pretty obvious. Cars like the Huracan and the Ford GT. Others, I think, are a bit subjective. I consider the F40 to still be a supercar, or a car like the C6 ZR1 is still a supercar. I also consider things to be like the GT500, the S550 GT500, and the Camaro ZL1, especially the 1LE model, to be supercars based on their performance. There is, I'm sure, a discussion to be had about what could be in this class and what couldn't. There's also another discussion to be had about what could be in hypercar class and what could be moved out of hypercar class. That's probably a good topic for a different video, as hypercar is kind of a mess itself. That said, this is the best of the best out of street. This would have the highest rating, and it would help kind of separate out cars that simply don't belong racing against regular street cars. So that is kind of my entire plan to at least correct the street classes. I think there's other classes in game that need work. I think this solution isn't perfect. I would prefer to do something like how Forza does things with so many individual classes, but at the same time I realize that's not very realistic for MotorFest and the Crew as a series. I realize this plan has issues. For example, what do you do with the tuned cars? Stuff like the Big Block 3100 and the Freedom Edition Plymouth, those are pretty obviously super high-powered cars. You've got a twin-turbo Roadrunner with massive brakes and tires, and you've got this track-built pickup truck. Obviously, those would be street tier A, or, you know, even in supercar. But with some of the other tuned cars, we have no information, or they're all parts and no extra power. For example, the Lucky Dragon is stock horsepower, but has tons of aftermarket. Where does that sit? We don't know. We don't have enough information. At the end of the day, all of this is subjective. This is just my idea. I'd like to see it implemented or something like it to help straighten out these classes. You guys have ideas, any criticisms, please leave them. This is the first video I've ever made like this. I'm not used to making content. I'd like to try it out more. If you enjoy this, let me know. If you don't enjoy this, let me know. If I should make more of this, let me know. Thank you.